right, guys, then I think we can get started. So thank you all for being here. I'm Keenan. I'm the chair of APRA, the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research Association. We're a non-profit academic association based here in Amsterdam with a focus on providing education about developments in psychedelic science, destigmatizing discussion of psychedelics in academia, and promoting the start of an interdisciplinary research effort in the Amsterdam universities. We organize lectures, journal clubs, other academic events, social events as well. And there's lots of ways to get involved with APRA. You can become a member, which also gives you access to a lot of different benefits like the monthly newsletter, discounts to events, and also access to our network. And really one of the biggest upsides is joining a community of people who are just as passionate about psychedelic science. So if you have any questions about that or are interested in joining, you can tap any of us on the shoulder after this or go to our website, which we can share in a bit. And it's also my honor to introduce our speaker for tonight, Daan Oostveen. I ran into him on the streets in the neighborhood.
Two times. True.
And we decided it was long overdue to invite Daan for a lecture for APRA. And now here we are, very grateful and honored for him to join us tonight. And now I'll give you his formal introduction. Daan is a philosopher and a scholar of religion working at the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies at the Faculty of Humanities at Utrecht University. He graduated from Ghent University with degrees in both philosophy and comparative literature. And his PhD was awarded by the Faculty of Theology and Religion at the VU, right here, with a doctoral dissertation on multiple religious belonging. For his doctoral research, he spent a year as a research fellow at the People's University of China in Beijing to study contemporary Chinese religious diversity in 2018. He's a founding member of the New European Humanities in the 21st Century Network. That's a lot of words. And editor-in-chief at the Oxford-based Wiley journal Future Humanities. His research interests include the new humanities, comparative religion, post-humanism, and psychedelic studies. So let's give all a warm applause to Daan.
Thank you so much, Kenan, and thank you, APRA, for inviting me. The introduction gives it all a lot of way. It's very funny to be back also at the VU, and I was just saying, like, the VU has this conservative image, but then a lot of things that happen here are very edgy, so it's always a bit unclear. And then, like, UvA has a very progressive image, and then things are super conservative, so it's always a bit unclear what's going on, what's happening. So I was asked to keep it introductory today, which I hope I will fail, or I hope I won't fail. I don't know yet. But then I also realized that really giving an introduction is super hard. I hate giving introductions because then you always miss important things, and you always have people in the back like saying, "Well, why not? What about this? What about this?" So maybe I always feel safer in going immediately into the crazy stuff. Originally, I didn't have the crazy stuff in, and then later I put in the crazy stuff, etc., etc. So, that's where we're going to start. So, I want to talk about the psychedelic humanities. So, I'm going to introduce you in the psychedelic humanities, and I might introduce it and immediately deconstruct it. I don't know. Usually, I get into deconstruction quite quickly, but let's not deconstruct. Let's say that there is something emerging which we can call psychedelic humanities. Not in the least because recently at the New School in New York, there was like a group of scholars coming together saying, okay, this is a panel on the psychedelic humanities. I wasn't there, very sad, wasn't invited. But then I thought, okay, yes, there is this term is getting some coinage, right? Something is going on here. Psychedelic humanities is rising. And we might not need to agree on whether we need even a psychedelic humanities. But also in the introduction, it said like we're talking about psychedelic science. And usually when I find my colleagues who study psychedelics, they're usually scientists. They do psychology or neurobiology or something clinical, something medical. But my colleagues who study psychedelics from a cultural perspective are actually rare, right? So I always also find it quite hard always to do these introductions. Because then you come with, you study some books and some culture, etc. But then you have to introduce somebody from another field in your own field. It's like interdisciplinary, right? And then sometimes it's hard to get the conversation going. But this is precisely why I think it's important and why I want to introduce it. Because I think when we talk about psychedelics, an important term here, and I call this semantics, I call this meaning, I think it's imagination, right? I think the question of imagination, which is a question of our society, is also the question of psychedelics. And I think this is often missed, or this is often lost. Usually we think that we understand how we have to think about psychedelics. And then you might think, well, no, that's not true because everybody has these biases. But actually we do, because we reproduce our ideas about psychedelics all the time. Saying, when we talk about psychedelics, this has a history. There is no universal way how we can understand psychedelics. There is a particular history how we got to thinking about psychedelics the way we do. And this history of how we think about psychedelics still defines or determines how we think about psychedelics today, even if we don't want it or even if we don't know. So it's about bias, right? So if the psychedelic humanities is about anything, it's about clearing out these biases, showing which biases we have, where we come from, but also teach people about where we come from, teach people about what the story is, where we come from, and then also, of course, the story where we're going. Also tell the story about how we're redefining what is the use of psychedelics, or what people say the use of psychedelics is. And I think fundamentally psychedelic humanities are about questioning these meaning-making processes, right? So it's funny, we always study it from a scientific perspective, but of course everybody who does have a degree in humanities or studies humanities knows that there are no straightforward methods, straightforward answers. Yes, you can do history. Yes, you can do legal theory. You can do linguistics. You can do literature. You can do anthropology, philosophy. But you will always see that you will run against certain methodological limits. And this is, of course, one of the challenges that emerge when we are going to do psychedelic humanities. So one of my main arguments will also be today that I think we need more cultural knowledge at our psychedelic studies tables, right? If you are in clinical research, it's important that you understand these cultural biases, that you know what defines it, and also see where you come from, because this is important. You have your own background, your own knowledge. You have been tripping in nature or whatever, or you are have only been scientific or whatever. But this context where you come from, what your positionality is, it matters, right? And there's, again, two very important works I want to emphasize. Positionality, where do you stand, is also very important in this whole sort of social justice discourse. And I think it matters, right? Because I think the main big idea about psychedelics, so this is the main question, how is our understanding of psychedelics defined by our cultural history? I have said, okay, the humanities, what is the humanities? What's the study of human culture, philosophy, art, history, meaning, language? That's like the fields that we usually think of when we talk about the humanities. And I will immediately also later on sort of deconstruct this idea that you can isolate the humanities. So one thing is why I think that psychedelic studies is so exciting, because it connects us to meaning-making processes as well as to brains and substances and chemical compounds and clinical therapies, right? So you need to be multidisciplinary. So then it's sad if everybody only comes from a clinical therapy background, right? So we need to have these conversations, but it's hard to have the conversations, especially because our cultural biases are so strong that it's sometimes hard to start the conversation. And the strongest bias I think we have in psychedelics, and that's something I want to get right into, is that psychedelics have to do something with the mind, right? With consciousness, right? I think that's a massive bias, which takes away other approaches to think about psychedelics. Why are psychedelics about the mind? Anyway, what is the mind? Why do we think about the mind? Why do we think that thinking about consciousness is a valid academic question? I'm not sure if it's a valid academic question. There's a long history thinking about the mind. There's a long history thinking about psyche, but that doesn't mean that we have to understand psychedelics through this Descartesian concept. And there you get your humanities in. Like Descartes says, okay, there's a split between the mind and the body. Of course, it's more complicated. Everybody who studied this knows, but basically the idea of Descartes is the idea of dualism, that you have the mind and the body. And the mind and the body dualism has continuously informed how we think about many things. That's actually the reason why we make a difference between the humanities, study of culture, and science, study of nature, right? So when I say psychedelic humanities, I'm not saying, okay, we have psychedelic humanities, and that's what we need to do. I'm actually saying we have one question that we share. And again, that question is imagination, right? And I say imagination is not something necessarily mental. It's not something of the mind. So you have that word psychedelics. So I'm going to do the introduction stuff here, right? So one of these guys which has been massively influential in how we think about psychedelics is Aldous Huxley, right? For those who know, for those who don't. But I think even those who are like not in the humanities, they know Aldous Huxley. So we are informed about our history, but we are being presented in a very particular way, right? And I'm already saying, interesting about Aldous Huxley, for example, that this book is about mescaline. Right? And mescaline doesn't feature very much in contemporary psychedelics research. I was recently at a conference, I was talking to somebody who's doing mescaline research, and they told me, you know, Dan, you know why we don't study mescaline anymore? Because that's something of the indigenous Americans. So studying mescaline would be cultural appropriation. We cannot do that. I think it's a fair argument, but it's interesting. We came from mescaline, now we're not studying it anymore. All the early interest in psychedelics, even before LSD was invented, was in mescaline. And now mescaline is only like in a very, very small corner of the conferences. Something to point out. So I'm also going to talk, when we talk about psychedelics, we're also talking about the shift about what's actually even being defined as psychedelics. So for this presentation, I was looking over the Wikipedia, because Wikipedia and also ChatGPT these days always gives you great information about what common opinion is, right? I mean, and it's very important to look at common opinion. Not to discredit it, but to see what would we suppose we think about these sort of things. And then it's about, okay, psychedelics are substances that change or alter our minds. So then you're back again, right? Because the mind is immediately a philosophical problem. It's also immediately a philosophical bias. It's in the word. I cannot get it out of psychedelics. Of course, I can think of other words to use. I can, for example, think of entheogens, or I can think of hallucinogens. But everybody would know, I will go back to this slide, but everybody will know that they have their own problems. So weirdly enough, I always stick with psychedelics, but with the awareness that the psyche is always already defining how we think about this stuff. And also when we think about clinical applications, which I'm going to talk about later, because that's the big, I would say, cultural shift that's happening in psychedelic culture, is this massive pouring of interest and money into the clinical therapy research, for very good reasons, by the way, but the mind and those ideas are still following us. And this cannot be stronger expressed by referring to this other book by Aldous Huxley. Of course, Aldous Huxley has this great book called Island, where, this is not in my preparation of my presentation, but I think I should refer to it. Everybody knows Brave New World, okay, and then people take drugs to sort of, because they have to zone out, because the world is so crappy. But there's also Island, and Island is the utopia of Aldous Huxley. There, young people who are 14 years old, they are actually giving mushrooms as a way of initiation into society. So there you have a positive story about psychedelics and drugs. It's a very rarely read. Who has read Island from Aldous Huxley? Okay, few have. Not so many, only 3. You know, who has read Brave New World? Not that many more, but indeed twice as much, right? So Island is the big recommendation. It's also actually hard to get your copy on. But here we have the big thing. I mean, I love Aldous Huxley, but he's also very problematic in a way of thinking in psychedelics culture that is rarely questioned. The idea of Aldous Huxley, and this is a very popular idea. I'm a religious studies scholar, and people say, oh, okay, so what's your religion? And they say, oh, I'm not really religious, I'm like spiritual, because I believe not in a particular religion, but I believe in something which is more universal, or which encompasses everything, which is something that includes everything, right? And then I say, I'm a religious studies scholar, so I say, well, wait a minute, did you know that Catholicos, the Catholic Church, means universal? It's a literal meaning of Catholicos. So if you're Catholic, you're part of the universal church. That's how the Pope looks at it. So the idea of universalism, and that you are somehow beyond particular traditions, is actually a very Christian biased idea. So if you're spiritual but not religious, then you're actually still part of a sort of universalist bias, right? So often we think of the counterculture as being, and this is of course where we start from when we study psychedelics, the counterculture is something that goes against inherited authorities, etc., etc. Free your mind, Timothy Leary, drop out, take psyche, expand your mind, right? And then you get in the sort of beyond other worlds, the perennial philosophy, the forever philosophy, the thing that we all share that goes beyond traditions. Well, it's a very nice idea, but it's culturally biased, right? It's contingent, right? And I think psychedelic humanities, if they're about anything, is about being clear about these contingencies, being also clear about how this is still religiously defined and determined. By the way, the whole idea of science and rationality also copies this universalist idea about something that we all share and getting out of the particularist sects, because we don't like the particularist sect, we always like the universal thinking. And when we think about psychedelics, and there's this great research on mysticism, and then you have like, okay, the mystic experience, is that something universal? Is that a sort of religious experience? This was William James found this very important, that we all share, Aldous Huxley as well. Or do we all trip completely differently, and is it like ineffable, but also not reducible to each other's experiences, right? And this is like in the big mysticism debate, is the thing, like to what extent are our experiences culturally biased? I'm always amazed with ayahuasca, by the way, how the images you see have nothing to do with anything you've ever encountered, which I always find a very strong argument against the cultural interpretation. But it doesn't mean that it's not particular, right? This is perennial philosophy. And I'm not discrediting it, just as much as I'm not discrediting it thinking about consciousness and psyche, but I want to point out that it's a bias, right? It is a bias. And there's nothing wrong with biases, but we have to know that it is a cultural bias. That's why the humanities is important when we start researching. What do you think of this? I mean, everybody imagines the psychedelic experience like this, right? But this is just an artist who created this. So there's a whole generation of people, us, who think of psychedelics as this, right? And then you think, yeah, I've been taking LSD, and then actually it looks like this. Well, but does it? I don't know. I mean, it's an you don't agree, right? So I saw Alex Gray in who this picture is. But this is actually not Alex Gray. This is actually Midjourney. This is actually telling Midjourney, please give me Alex Gray, right? So Midjourney already, like the AI generator, already knows what Alex Gray looks like or should look like. So what I'm trying to argue here is that both the visually, but also philosophically, we think that we know what we're talking about. Yeah, it looks like this. It's about universal philosophy. It's about the religious big experience, mysticism, blah, 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 blah. But these are culturally defined biases which only emerged in the 20th century Western mind, right? So we can get into indigenous critiques, non-Western critiques, which I'm all going in later. And these are all reasons why psychedelic humanities are important. Because if you don't know the history, you cannot see where it happens, right? And then you cannot see that the guy who invented this is actually still alive, right? I met him in Denver 3 months ago. And I think that everybody in the history of mankind has always experienced this, which is crazy, right? There's all these discussions about like what's particular, etc., etc. So this is my terminology slide. For lack of a better word, I always stick with psychedelics. But even it was coined by this guy, Humphrey Osment. He was a psychiatrist. It was, of course, also interesting to think of. Crazy mind, non-crazy mind, the whole idea of craziness. Foucault has written great books about what defines to have like a sane mind and a crazy mind. I'm not going into that, but of course Foucault is very helpful here as well. And theogens I like, because then you say, well, there's entheos, enthusiasm inspired by the gods, and genesis, genestai, from the Greek, it's what generates something that's inspired by the gods. However, problem with this term is, of course, that it overly religifies it. I'm a religious studies scholar, I love religifying things, but is that the only story you can tell, right? I'm critical of a complete secularization story of psychedelics, reducing it only to clinical outcomes and brains, etc., etc. But I'm equally critical of only telling the story from a religious perennial experience perspective. And of course, that's where the word entheogen comes in. And of course, then you have hallucinogen, which of course has this problem. I didn't go really deep in the etymology, so you may critique me on this. But of course, with the idea of hallucinogen, you have the idea of a real reality and a hallucinated reality. I always say, well, if you experience it, it's real because you experience it in this world, right? I find that very strong about psychedelics, that what I experience is real for the sake of me experiencing it. Zhuangzi, the famous Chinese philosopher, says, well, last night I was dreaming I'm a butterfly, now I'm awake. And now I'm drunk again, but I'm actually not sure. Maybe I'm actually a butterfly dreaming that he's me, right? I don't know. The only thing that I know is that there's a difference. So let's just keep it at that. There's a difference between me sleeping and waking, and that's the changing of things, right? And then you get all into these discussions about dreaming and being awake. Also the whole ideal of awakening. Oh, I'm so awake because I understand the truth about the system. Oh, I'm so woke because I understand the truth about social justice. You see how this imagination, the matrix, blue pill, red pill, you know, awakening to the true vision is also defining our culture. It's another bias. The trip, the journey, taking up psychedelic as a journey. Ever thought about it? Why is it a journey? Why is it not something you do on a Tuesday afternoon and just like to puke with a group of people, just like riding your bike? Why is it always mystified, right? It is mystified. But why does it need to be like that, right? That's like one of the questions I always have, and I think that's one of the questions we have to get into. That's with hallucination and reality. So in a sense, it doesn't matter what is real, right? I'm very skeptical of the whole idea of truth. But everybody you will meet, especially somebody who calls themselves a philosopher of psychedelics, I hate the term, I'm not a philosopher of psychedelics, please don't call me like that. Because then you always get these people who say, yeah, the mystical, the true, right, expression of that. I think that's not the philosophical question we should ask about psychedelics, right? I think these questions I'm asking now are the questions we should ask about the philosophy of psychedelics. Why are we always using that same lingo? And we think that it makes sense and it's so truthful and insightful. I'm not sure about it, right? I'm later giving you the alternative. I really hate solutions, but I will give you an alternative, right? Okay, so what I'm going to say, of course, is, and this is, I think, for the whole of culture, it's important. There's a difference between critical scholarship and critique as something rejecting something. And I think we really need critical scholarship, right? That's what I'm in favor for. Whatever discipline you're in, I don't care. Critical scholarship means that you put out a hypothesis, you're going to test it, and you're going to see if it works or it fails, right? And that's actually also in the humanities like that. It's not so experimentally defined, but you cannot just say, believe something into existence, right? And a lot of humanities scholars make that mistake, right? So to one extent, the sciences are more critical because they do define their hypothesis, that they can be tested. But then again, everybody who's been to psychedelic conferences also know that people are looking for positive results, that null results are often hidden or not shown, etc. I see people nodding, so you know what I'm talking about. So we have to find this balance, especially if we're interested in psychedelics, which probably you are because you're here, between like uncritically critical and between uncritical enthusiastic, right? We have to see what are our biases. What do we, when we start doing research, and this will be a main thread in my talk today, into, for example, the benefits for psychedelics in mental health. What is the bias there? Well, the bias is that we need to solve mental health, that it's a problem, and that psychedelics might be able to do that, right? I'm not disagreeing with this, but we have to be clear that this is the bias. This is the way we're approaching the topic, right? And that's, I think, where humanities come in handy. I come in with an open mind, right? I don't know what's going on, right? And that's also what's nice about psychedelics, that you don't know the fuck what's going on, right? And we are losing, to a certain extent, that sense, which is, I think, so strong that you just don't know the fuck what's going on. It's not about perennial philosophy because you start hallucinating like a prophet. It's not like, oh, this is a great tool for mental health per se, right? I'm not discarding it, but it's not per se that it's this, just as much as it's not per se, and it's also not an indigenous tool of healing per se. It's nice to have that conversation at the table, but again, it's part of the cultural bias. So why is psychedelic humanities important? Because it allows us to be critical to our meaning-making processes, to our imaginations, right? And that's what it's about, and that's ultimately what I think psychedelics teaches us. Now making a strong statement, I know that, but I think you can you allow that, right? Okay, so I had this generated actually also by ChatGPT because I like to ask I thought, okay, we need to do the introduction. So what's ChatGPT going to tell me that I really shouldn't skip over? And I said, well, give me the history of psychedelics. I said to ChatGPT, give it for me from like 1920 to the present. And ChatGPT said, I think I used 3.5 and not 4, I don't know anymore. I think I used 3.5. Because I wanted to have it as stupid as possible. And it just said, okay, there's 4 phases, right? So the first phase is early research, mostly masculine, and then the important moment is, of course, Albert Hofmann in Basel, synthesizing LSD, right? I think that's still the great story of psychedelics is Albert Hofmann. Everybody can agree on that, right? It's the great story of psychedelics, right? And I think LSD, to a certain extent, is the great story of psychedelics. Then you have the so-called psychedelic revolution, the 50s and the 60s. Then you get what we call the backlash, the legal backlash, and the so-called psychedelic winter. Of course, this whole period between the 70s and the 90s, you can divide up in certain, first it started backlash, then the strong backlash, then like the psychedelic winter, and then in the 90s there was some early research. And then from 2000 onwards, actually 2010s, I would say, we would talk about what we then call the psychedelic renaissance, right? So this is the cultural history only of the 20th century, 21st century, of psychedelic research, right? Of course, there's also the whole anthropological history. There's also the whole antique history. We have to be a bit careful here because, again, there's a lot of people coming in making all these big claims about stoned apes, like Terence McKenna, or saying, the Indians, they must have used drugs, right? Don't also try to find drugs everywhere, because that's just as odd as denying it altogether. But of course, this is like when you really want to do sort of cultural history. It's a nice hypothesis to think that the Indians actually had psychedelics, but then did they, right? So that's always a bit of the question. And again, anthropology is very important because anthropology is very strongly coming in here, of course, with the need for, and I'm now going to use my first more complicated terms, like indigenous epistemologies. Like, how does the indigenous mind think, have knowledge about psychedelics? That's also something coming in. Okay, I promise you to do the introduction right. So you have people like Timothy Leary in a part of that of the revolutionary period. And I never introduced Timothy Leary in the slide. So I thought, okay, what should you really say about it? And I think the best thing to say about Timothy Leary is that he is the main reason why there was so much interest, and he's also the main reason why there was this big backlash. I think that's the easiest way to introduce Timothy Leary. All the rest is just lore and story, and you can read it yourself. Okay, so there's always people you're skipping, and there's also people you're focusing on. I love these people. These were actually the people I was introduced in most when I was young. Because Sasha Shulgin, he synthesized, I think, hundreds, if not more, compounds, and he all used them himself as well, right? So there was this whole idea, like, why should you stick with sort of bad trip, crappy LSD if you can design the best drug possible, right? This was actually the project, I think, of Sasha Shulgin, and for me, okay, personal thing, like I think my all-time favorite psychedelic trip was with 2CB, and he invented this stuff, right? So, but this was part of my set and setting. So I don't think this can be repeated. I'm not going to say this is the best drug ever, but that's like for me like the real opening point. And then I thought, okay, that was Shulgin, right? And Shulgin and 2CB is like his product, and which became also part of the general culture. Of course, it mixes a little bit the effects of amphetamines and LSD, why I think it shouldn't be classified as a psychedelic strictly, but I'm going to go into that later. But that's why I always want to introduce Shulgin as part of the revolution. Then you have this guy called Stanislav Grof, for those who know, or for those who don't know. He does this stuff called holotropic breath work, and he also already used LSD as trauma healing. But he also was already engaged very early on with these sort of trauma resolution questions, which are now super big, right? Because we have the mental health crisis, and we're gonna use psychedelics to solve that, right? That's sort of the idea. Stanislav Grof was in this early phase definitely a front runner on that, and a lot of his theories that we are still using, right? But again, it's part of a history, so we might have to kill the fathers. Very Freudian, as I always say, kill the fathers, kill our Timothy Learys and our Stanislav Grofs and even Shulgin. I'm going to kill Shulgin tonight, right? Let's all do that. But all these people, they stick with the classic question of consciousness, right? And I think it's just the wrong question. I deny the whole question of consciousness. So I guess for me, I'm not about consciousness. Nothing to do with consciousness. Because consciousness is not even a thing. I think consciousness is a remnant of a Christian mindset in which you think that things have a soul, etc., and they have an afterlife, etc., right? And I'm actually coming out as a strong materialist, right? And because there's an irony here, because people say, oh, I'm so scientific, I only do what's in my data. But then again, when you ask them privately, they have all these huge ideas about the afterlife. And so there's always this big paradox going on there, I think, between what people privately believe and the scientists they have to be in the lab. As if you go to the university, then all of a sudden you have to be a reductive materialist scientist, and when you're home, you're gonna like drop out in space and say, we're gonna talk about the afterlife. I think one of the challenges here is that we bring those discourses together, see that the so-called scientific discourse is not so neutral, and that the spaced out Aldous Huxleyan or maybe Terence McKennian discourse is still very much defining us in private, and we have to come to terms with it. We have to come into account with it. So this classic question of consciousness, Marci Nevian, she told it to me like this in the train. She went through this whole revolution. I mean, I was born in the 80s, I'm a postmodern kid all. But so it was after this, but you were even like most of your Gen Z, so it's even different. So she said in the psychedelic revolution, it was all about freedom, freeing your mind, expanding, right? And now it's about healing and health, right? That was her basic cultural analysis. And I agreed with that. Of course, I had all these problems with it, but I think it's basically true. I think that analysis is basically true. So, okay, what are psychedelics? And I think there's only 4 psychedelics. Of course, this is not true, but I think there's only really 4. Culturally relevant are only 4. And these are the 4. And one of the big stories of the new psychedelic research is not on this map. Actually, the biggest story of psychedelic research is not here. And this is interesting, right? And I think even the number 2 is also not on here, right? So what we call psychedelics when we talk about the psychedelic revolution, those are actually number 3 and 4, right? And but in the classical sphere, it was these 4. It was the mescaline, very important. That's a cactus, right? It's a plant. Then you have LSD, which is a fungi. Ultimately, it's like growing on the grass, etc., etc. I mean, some will know it. And as you see, psychedelic humanities are not about discarding these sort of life histories. I think those are very important. Psilocybin, psilocin, and psilocybin are of course mushrooms as well. And then there's DMT, right? And then DMT, there's also a lot of mystique around that as well. But it's also mainly found in plants, right? So we see all 4 here, even LSD, although you don't think of it, are found in sort of natural species, right? And I think that is culturally super relevant, right? The fact that ultimately taking a psychedelic is an encounter or is eating another plant, another body on this planet, which are also, by the way, we have a family relation with the plants, right? We share genes with those plants, right? So we have a sort of, they're like far away, removed cousins of us that we go into interaction with. That's what Donna Haraway will later call a kinship relationship, right? So it's like taking a psychedelic to a certain extent, you can understand, and not many people are doing that, you can understand it as an encounter with a long deceased relative, right? And a lot of people have stories about, okay, regression therapy and going back to former lives. I'm not saying I believe in former lives because I don't think I do in the normally cultural sense, but I'm just saying this is also a story, right? And humanities is about stories. It's about what stories tell ourselves, right? Okay, and then you have the others, right? 2CB, okay, that's a mix between amphetamine and psychedelic. MDMA, that's like the big one. It's now listed with the psychedelics, but when I was young and nobody told me it's a psychedelic, it was an amphetamine, right? It was an upper. You have upper, downers, and the real deal, right? And the uppers and downers you shouldn't take, and the real deal, that's different. But that's not drugs, right? That's how I was told it. And now all of a sudden, MDMA is coming in. Ketamine is, of course, a completely different category, which is interesting, I think. But of course, it's used a lot, and of course, there's great results here. So we have to see also that there is a cultural shift going on in the definition of even what the psychedelic is, what counts as a psychedelic, in function also of this sort of mental health use. I'm going to look at the clock because so much more to tell, and that's not going to work. Okay, so then you have this setting stops, and I'm going to go over this. This was like one of the big frameworks of the 60s, 70s psychiatric therapy, right? So there's a mindset, there's a setting, there's a context, there's the substance, and all those 3 define together the sort of encounter or experience you have, right? This was like the big framework, and I think the framework to a sense still works. Okay, then there's the psychedelic renaissance. And I already told you, right, it's about health and healing, right? But it's also about commodification. And that's an important critical story here. Because when you have a product that can heal people, you can sell that product, right? You can sell it like you can sell the therapy, because you know the therapy. You can sell the program to instruct therapists, right? You can say, okay, you pay 5,000 euro and you're going to become a psychedelic therapist because we know the science, right? And there's big market for this. You might be in one of these programs yourself, right? I'm not saying you shouldn't, but there is capital coming in here, right? Within this health and healing paradigm, so you get something what Selim Sess has called corporadelic as well. I'm going to go back to this as well. But there's also, of course, more societal acceptance, especially in the United States, where you see, of course, very strong shift from war on drugs to legalization that the Netherlands has never seen, right? For example, although we still think of the Netherlands as a liberal country, but the Netherlands is somewhere at the bottom of the former. And there's also something which I call the purging of the hippies. Right, the purging of the hippies. So to a certain extent, we're like, I think you all like dressed up nicely, like no one has dreadlocks, right? So we are starting to behave better. The people who are allowed also, and the people who are like still the dirty hippies with the dogs, they're actually, well, you get also your corner, but you have still these crazy ideas. We don't want to be associated with you too much because we're scientists, right? There's the purging of the hippies, and it happens in certain conferences. And for sometimes for good reason, and sometimes you can question, or you can just say, okay, there's a cultural shift. The kind of people who say, oh, I'm doing psychedelics, is a different kind of people than the Timothy Leary people. That's a cultural shift. Look at what's going on. I was in 2016, I think, in Amsterdam, ICPR, only hippies. 4 years later, Prague, half hippies. 3 years later, Berlin, only corporate people, right? What happened? What shifted? Did we just suddenly dress up nicer? Did our houses become better value because we got older? Well, what sort of weird millennials are we, right? Look at what's going on. Okay, the big three, great stuff, of course. The Beckley Foundation, understanding of LSD, DMT unconsciousness. So it's the old consciousness question. Amanda Fielding. I love the woman, by the way, because she can be so clear on saying, yeah, ultimately it's all about the magic of the LSD, and I think that's awesome, right? So Beckley Foundation is important, and of course the big one is MAPS, right? And MAPS is great, and it's also terrible. It's defining the field, so we have to engage with it. There's no reason to be fundamentally critical. The results are great. We have phase 3 trials. They are critical people. They know what they're doing. They're reaching out. They call themselves multidisciplinary, right? And they have the results. They carry, I think, ultimately they carry the revolution, right? So it's like what all the startups, like this is the open AI of psychedelic studies. I think you can say it's something like that. Now we can already make AI references to this. And then, of course, you have this guy. Love this guy as well, Paul Stamets. Mycology. Why do I like this guy so much? I think I like this guy so much because he expresses mostly a kind of culture that I think we should have in psychedelic studies more. He takes it broader. He loves mushrooms. He loves tripping on mushrooms. But he also likes the conversation with mushrooms and talking and having them in the armchair and going digging them up and see how they illuminate, etc. So he takes, I think, the plant aspect of the mushroom very serious. And of course, in the pandemic, we were all like doing fermenting at our homes, kefir making, etc. Well, this guy was, of course, part of this whole mushroom revolution, and I think I have a weakness for this guy as well, right? So these are of course I could name more, but you can ask everybody to name all the other ones. But I think these are the ones that really need mention, with MAPS as the most important, because of course they do MDMA assisted therapy for psychotherapy for PTSD. That's their phase 3 trial, right? That's their big flagship, right? It's MDMA is the flagship, also in the Netherlands. And I love this stuff. But is it psychedelics? It's an interesting question, right? Psilocybin and LSD for end-of-life anxiety, right? There you get back with the sort of end-of-life palliative questions, also this whole question of DMT as maybe something that emerges when you die or whatever, part also of our cultural heritage. And then, of course, ayahuasca, used for addiction and PTSD. And of course, some research into marijuana. And of course, ayahuasca is a complicated one here as well. Clearly psychedelic, but also clearly not psychedelic, because you start puking from it, you have these horrible experiences. It's almost always embedded, or usually embedded, in very cultural shamanistic settings. So yes, now there's an ayahuasca pill, but that's actually rare. You also don't need it because you could smoke DMT. So actually the working compound is already combined of these two plants, and actually the plant which enables the psychedelic, that's actually the name of the plant, of the of the substance, right? The ayahuasca is the Cacti. It's the one that doesn't have the psychedelic substance. It's the one that has the enabler, right? Of course, this is masculine, feminine thing, the cultural, of course, the cultural thing coming in here. But of course, in MAPS, it's really about, okay, how can we use it? It's the functionalist question. Well, then, of course, we have Michael Pollan. And the big pollen effect is because now we can look it on Netflix, and this helps really like explaining to your grandmother why you go to these things at the university campus, right? Because it's now big. Okay, so let me see if I can go a bit quicker. These are like really recent articles just to give an overview. Make psilocybin accessible for palliative care, and it's about legalization. It's about getting it accepted. The US could soon approve MDMA therapy. This is 19 April 2023 in Nature, right? This is based on MAPS. And then, of course, there's these ketamine trials. This was on the BBC, you know, against addiction. Iboga, of course, is also on that list there. I already said there's 4 psychedelics, but of course, you all know there's tons of them. But you see here ketamine and Iboga coming in very strongly. Okay, so then there's this slide. But I actually went over this already a little bit. I actually said already, okay, there are cultural biases, right? There's dualisms. There's the idea that we should be very scientific. But then, of course, there's also this whole idea that, well, everybody's very enthusiastic, so there's no critical basis anymore. There's also this idea of reductive materialism or neuroreductionism, that we only talk about brains and what's happening in brains. And of course, there's this big one, Neoplatonism. That's my perennial philosophy, that ultimately there's a sort of universal experience. This will be published in an article at the end of the year, so in the Lowe study, so you can all read it slowly. And of course, there's functionalism, and that's an interesting one, because that's the question, what use are psychedelics, right? And I already said to you something like, maybe it's nice to not define a use, right? Maybe it's just play. And maybe in the 60s and 70s, 50s and 60s, okay, Leary thought that it was going to change society, but he also thought it was just great fun, right? Or just play, or just a hobby, right? Why are you not allowed to just puke on a Saturday night, as I often say, right? You take ayahuasca, and a lot of people are already doing that. They're like, I don't care about mental health, blah, 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 phase-free trials, legalization. I'm just going to trip my balls out on a Saturday night, right? And we always say that it's recreative, and recreative always has a little bit of the negative turn. But yeah, what's recreative? It's just riding a bicycle, right? So then you have to assess, is it safe, is it dangerous? And then we know, well, a lot of things that we used to think about safety are actually not true. But yeah, there's still safety concerns. But yeah, driving a car is also unsafe, right? So yeah, it's just like any human activity, right? You eat a plant, something happens, okay? Be careful, right? So yeah, if we know that, if you have experience, it's also not a big deal, right? And then so why should we even devote time to it if it's just like, okay, I don't care, right? It's not even recreative, it's just, okay, fine, right? And then there's reverse Orientalism. That's like saying, oh, we shouldn't rely on the scientific wisdom because the indigenous people have been working with these plants for so long, we should listen to them. Yeah, that's really great, but that's also nonsense, right? It's not because scientific society is so bad that the opposite is all of a sudden good. That's like projecting the good on the other, right? Oh, because they're minorities, because they're indigenous, because they're in the East, because they have nothing to eat, they're great in their wisdom. Well, no, it's not true, right? I mean, there's all sorts of knowledge and we have to critically assess everything. And I want the indigenous perspectives on the table, but they are not inherently better than a scientific perspective, nor inherently worse, right? We have to assess them critically for their epistemological value, right? And with some audiences, I really have to explain that you have to have them on the table because they're like, I'm not going to listen to these crazy Indians. And with other audiences, I have to explain to them that we shouldn't adopt everything that they're saying either, because they're actually often copying Western biases, weirdly enough, right? Dualisms I've been talking about. Okay, this is somebody, when we talk about psychedelic humanities, to me, there's just one person, and that's Naja Devino. She's very young. I think she's extraordinary. She does great work. She works in the limelight. She's now coming up a little bit. I think she's younger than me or about my age. And she really goes deep into this critical assessment of what's going on in this psychedelic psychosphere, right? What's going on? She coined the term, well, not her, but her group coined the term of corporadelic. Of course, it's also about psychedelic capitalism, right? What's happening when all the money coming in? Everybody wants to have a startup or start like a startup for startups or a startup with cryptocurrencies and psychedelics and AI so that you can sell it to investors and then the venture capital comes in, etc. Also, it's nice because it makes you perform better. Microdosing, I'm very skeptical of microdosing. You can try to convince me otherwise. I think, yeah, it's nice to microdose a little bit, but I don't believe all the big claims. I'm saying this very unnuanced here. It's nice, it's okay, yeah, it's interesting. But the critique, I think, is stronger than the benefits. And the critique is, well, doesn't it ultimately fit you into a like work harder, work more mindset, like, okay, now we're going to take psychedelics so that we can perform better all of a sudden, right? As a sort of neuro biohacking sort of definition. I have nothing inherently against biohacking, but usually it's a bit weird stuff, right? And that's also with microdosing coming in. I'm also a lot of the results are very techy in the field, right? Okay, so you can make note of that. Mental health is political, right? Everybody's saying there's a mental health crisis, right? You might know that there's a mental health crisis because you see people dropping out around you because of COVID or whatever, or crisis, or cannot find housing or whatever. I don't know. I have a mental health crisis. We all have burnout. We get quarter life crisis as 23, etc. And of course, that is a money-making machine because then if you can sell a promise to mental health, yeah, that's great stuff because there's a mental health crisis, right? Everybody is suffering. And I think you see a really... Okay, let's just call it like that dangerous intersection here. This I got from a sort of VC site. This is the sort of copy they write. I think they're now going to have it written by ChatGPT because you actually, like, who actually needs to write this sort of copy? But this sort of copy is like, as of today, almost 1 billion people worldwide suffer from various mental health issues, causing $2 trillion to $5 trillion lost in poor health and lost productivity annually, right? So you see the business model immediately there in one sentence, all right? Oh, how much can we make if we can sell a product to all these suffering people? Huh? They don't tell you that a lot of their therapies cost thousands of euros, although you can actually buy psychedelics for €6 in the store. But yeah, there has to be a product and that has to be scientific, and then you can rebrand it and sell it, etc. And with coming of COVID-19, it's pronounced a rise in number of people gravitate depressive orders, anxiety disorders. Okay, we're all anxious, and then the psychedelics come in, right? They're going to help you. This is the functionalism. This is also the capitalism, right? Okay, so these are all issues like the whole idea of health. What does it even mean to be healthy? That is ultimately a philosophical question. Right? We're all going to die, right? I mean, I have a chronic disease, right? I'm mortal, I'm dying, right? I will die within 40, 50 years, right? So what's health anyway, right? Can you even heal, right? Same thing with this dualism between, okay, you're asleep, now you're awake, you're sick, now you're healthy. Oh, we're all sick, yeah? You all get toxins, we all get PFAS in our body, for Christ's sake, right? So my point here is like healing as a product, like, okay, now you're sick, now you're going to buy the product and now you heal. It is also a crisis of the whole, I think, medical sector, right? Like, what are we really selling? It's also getting like massively expensive. But in the end, we're all going to die, right? And then you need LSD for end-of-life cure or understanding or whatever, blah, blah, blah. So the question of health is a big philosophical problem here. What is human flourishing anyway, right? Aren't we all always sick? And is that maybe also fine to be sick, right? Yes, there's suffering, and suffering can be alleviated, etc., etc. But don't always go into this transhumanist mindset that we have to get over all of that, right? The question of health here is crucial because this is how psychedelics are rebranded. It's rebranded as a function, you can take it, it can heal you, right? It's not about tripping out, freeing your mind with Timothy Leary, it's about selling the product to free your mind. And we have phase 3 trials to prove it, right? So now we need FDA approval. Look, the great brave new world of psychedelics is here, right? Again, I'm not fundamentally skeptical, but we have to question it. We have to see what's happening. We have to see who's rebranding, why is rebranding, why is all of a sudden MDMA on the top of the list and mescaline is nowhere to be found, right? How does cultural appropriation really work, right? And what do we want to sell when we're going to sell something? Okay, so you have the indigenous epistemologies. I asked Midjourney to do this and it always gave me this sort of Orientalist Indian, so I actually didn't want to show it. I gave him another prompt, it still didn't really work out. Okay, I already said indigenous epistemologies are important, even if we have to be skeptical and not always fall in the trap of reversed Orientalism, believing everything the wise Indians say, right? That's a pitfall. Nevertheless, I am all in favor of epistemologic diversity. Don't give me that crappy story about perennial philosophy. Don't give me the crappy story about how it's going to solve the mental health crisis. You fucking took the stuff. So what did you really learn from it? Give me something new. Give me something exciting. Or are you going to prove to me, like there was this old farmer who hosted ayahuasca parties every year, and then the group came and then they said, yeah, we're going to like become really free and expand our minds and heal. And then the farmer said, well, they've been saying this for 30 years and nothing really changed, right? So there's always the promise of change. This is also with Leary, but also today. And maybe it's fine to accept that it's also fine when nothing changes. When it's, again, like just puking on Saturday night, which is great stuff. And I can recommend it to everybody. But it doesn't have to lead to fundamental better results, right? It doesn't have to. It might, it can, it's nice. I'm not going to deny it. But who am I to say, okay, it's all just fine. Okay, you have the neo-hippies and the ayahuasca shamanism. Of course, there are new perspectives coming in also the new spirituality movement. Of course, you have also the whole discussion with the anti-vax hippies and the wappies, but also the question of the yoga right, and then also the people who are like taking drugs in the weekend and going to yoga schools through the week. So you see also the whole neo-hippie ayahuasca culture also is not standing still, right? So there's also things happening there as well. And then you have the corporadelics, which I already pointed at. Okay, it's 8:05. Let me see what I'm gonna say to finish off here. We can do something in the Q&A because then we have a little bit more time. Of course, zoom out. There's this whole field of new humanities emerging, which say those critical questions I'm asking you now for psychedelics, but they go for a lot of scientific domains. Environmental crisis, the end of the world is near. Wow, that's a biblical metaphor, right? Is the end of the world near, or are we just quoting the Bible here, right? Are we going to save the planet, right? Oh, that's the hero story. I know the hero story. That's prop. I got it from Russian formalism, right? But we don't talk about this stuff, right? So that's environmentalism. Digital humanities, well, I don't have to talk to you. Every ethicist now has an opinion about what ChatGPT is going to change the world. Everybody's falling over each other with, it's going to be doom, or it's going to be great, or jobs are going to disappear, or whatever. And calm the fuck down, yeah, right? But that's humanities questions, right? Same goes for health, right? Biohealth, I don't need a doctor anymore. Anyway, I heard a guy saying that the chat doctor was perceived kinder and nicer and more humane than the real doctor. There's anecdotal evidence, of course, but it's very striking, right? It's very striking. So what does it mean even to be humane or to be human or to be real, etc., etc.? Well, that's what the humanities are for, right? And we don't have to limit ourselves to the field of cultural products. Everything is a cultural product. Science is a cultural product, ultimately as well. Maybe only mathematics is not, but for the rest, all science is a cultural product, right? So these are all the new humanities, psychedelic humanities, maybe in emerging fields. Who are the big people you have to follow here? This is my list. You can copy it. I think these are the interesting people. There's some people absent here. I think they shouldn't be on the list, so I didn't put them there. Who you would think, yeah, but that's a great name in psychedelic science, right? And I'm like, well, I'm not sure. They're just copying things that they've been saying before. I don't agree with all these people here, by the way. But I think Nezha Devino is by far the most interesting. But most of them have written very interesting stuff. Think about visual culture. Think about, of course, about philosophy. Think about history, anthropology. Like there's a whole history of tea, how tea traveled the world. When tea arrived from China in Tibet, the Tibetans, they only drank milk, right? So they didn't have vitamin C in their diet. Then tea came from China. All of a sudden they had vitamin C and they conquered the world, or at least China. Of course, then they were beaten back. But there's a whole history of this plant, right? Psychedelics are ultimately histories of plants and how they circulate, right? How they are brought from one place to another through colonialism. Colonial stories are very important here. The whole question, of course, of the appropriation of ayahuasca anyway. You can start about it. So here's my list. What's the meaning of health? What's the meaning of psychedelics? How should humans understand our relationship with this stuff, right? What's the history of drugs? What place do psychedelics take in there? History of the research, indigenous histories. How does it relate to religion? I'm not saying it has nothing to do with religion, but I deny the universalist story. Visual culture is interesting. economic impacts, politics, climate change, ecology, mental health, mysticism, all sort of texts, all sort of literatures. It's 8:10. I'm going to leave it at here. I'm going to leave it at this. Yeah, because all the other slides I'm going only crazy. So there's more you can listen to me later in other talks. But this is trying to be the overview of the sort of questions I think I ask and we should all ask, and you don't have to agree with everything, but it's all about storytelling. And I like as many stories as possible at the table. And when everybody is just copying the same sort of analysis all the time, I'm like, actually, well, you say you're a scientist, but you didn't do any bit of critical thinking. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Daan. I'm sure there's plenty of questions in the audience. Anyone? Marco?
Did I see? Oh yeah, Marco Akil. Yes, I now recognize you. Great. You do the visual stuff.
Yes, the visual stuff. So thank you for the talk. It's not the first talk that I see from you, so it's always nice. And I'm on board with like your perspective. There was only one aspect that maybe you didn't spend much time on, that maybe you can elaborate on. When you had the four kind of classic psychedelics you mentioned, they all come from like plants. And so, I mean, you also mentioned 2CB, right? And you mentioned that it's been invented, it's been synthesized, it's not necessarily something that comes from plants. So I was wondering about this. This is part of the story. Let's say, if you think there is something different, specific about something that comes from plants per se, or is it just in the way you approach it, in the attitude of it, the way you approach it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, no, I think because, for example, cannabis is also on there, right? And what's the origin of ketamine? I don't know. I didn't want to make a dualism between natural and synthetic. I think if you can invent synthetic ayahuasca, I think it would be great, right? So I'm not at all against. I think that's also one of the arguments, by the way, that we should. But that's something I didn't have much time for. We should embrace both the technological and the ecological and the natural, right? It's not about finding the natural way or going into the transhumanist technological sphere, right? So synthesizing is great, but reconnecting with the plants is also great, right? Do both and be critical of both, right? Don't go into a sort of neo-Luddite hippiness when you say, oh, everything has to be fucking natural, right? Because natural things can be very, very bad for you, right? Again, there is no difference between the natural and the artificial. It's the same thing. It's the same stuff, right? So no, I don't think so. However, and if I go with you, I do like to go back to imagining at least the bodies where these things come from. Like again, LSD, we usually think of it as chemical or synthetic, but yeah, no, it's not. It actually comes from grass, etc., etc. So tracing back these natural stories and then say, okay, how do we relate to these plants? Why do these plants come into our life? Why does Mother Ayahuasca tell us that we should take it, right? How do we get into that sort of conversation? And that can also go for the others, right? So again, there's no inherent. I don't know how. I mean, Shulgin must have done something to get to CB, and he must have used natural products as well. I don't know. I'm not a chemist, but ultimately everything derives from nature. Yeah.
Did I understand right that you think perennial philosophy is biased because like the Catholic Church already had similar ideas? And if so, for an idea to be unbiased, does it have to be completely novel and unfiltered by your social background?
I'm a religious studies scholar and I'm very critical of truth exclusivism. And I think one of the big inventions here is truth exclusivism. And ultimately the idea of a universal religious experience is also truth exclusivism. It's just in a new... people who say I'm not religious but I'm spiritual are also truth exclusivists, but in their own way. So I am like, have everybody on the table, and some things I think are crap and some things are nice, but you can all be in, and I won't be into everything. So I do think that when you do cultural history, you see Western culture. I never liked that word Western culture, but is the big story of truth exclusivism, right? The Jew said we have a special contract with God. Jesus says it applies to everybody, and the Muslims copy that, right? And science also copies that idea, right? To talk with Dawkins. it's a very contagious meme to think that you want to go to truth, right? And I think that's a very strong, bad idea, right? Religion is not a bad idea, truth exclusivism is, to talk with that. So I'm not saying it's because of you. A lot of religious people, Christian people, you will say, I'm not religious, I believe in the truth, right? I follow the path of Jesus. There's only one path. There's no religion. There's no other religions. By the way, the whole idea that there are different religions is an invention of the 19th century. Before that, people just said, well, there's no other religions, they just follow the truth. And all the other people, they're idolaters or they're weird. Like Muslims were not another religion, they were really weird Christians, right? We can talk for hours about this. So the whole idea that we should somehow have respect for other religions is also a cultural invention, right? And I'm a scholar of multiple religious belonging and religious diversity, and I say, well, religions are not inherently bad or inherently good. It's crappy stuff, just like everything in the world, and you can play around with it. It's fine. You can like it, dislike it. But truth exclusivism, I think, is something to avoid. Yeah, okay, no.
Question as well. You mentioned Foucault very briefly.
Yeah.
I'm interested in this mental health discussion that you very briefly started.
Yeah.
When I think of Foucault, I also think about like his critique of institutions, like psychiatry,
Exactly, yeah.
as kind of like enforcing what is normal, healthy functioning and behavior.
Yeah, definitely.
Psychiatry has gotten a very bad rap in the past few decades, and psychedelics are now receiving a very positive PR in the past few years. Do you think psychedelics could be something that could give psychiatry kind of a more positive PR and actually paradoxically kind of increase the power of psychiatry, or at least the perception people have of psychiatry being a good thing, a good force?
I find it dangerous to answer. A great question. I find it dangerous to answer your question because I'm not day-to-day working in the psychiatric field. So I really find it. I find it difficult. I don't want to like be critical of colleagues that I actually don't have much idea about. I would think that we will find out, as Joost Spreeksma is also saying, that psychedelics are just another tool in the toolbox which don't do something, and maybe more than placebo, but that's it, right? So I'm not sure if psychedelics will be able to give psychiatry a better reputation. So no, I'm not sure about that. Maybe we conclude from a psychiatric perspective that it's actually better to go back to, I don't know, psychotherapy, right? I'm a hidden in the closet Freudian to a certain extent, right? I don't. Maybe I just don't believe even in per se in the healing value of these things. So I'm skeptical. Also, I think because a part of the mental health crisis, whatever it is also it's a crisis of how we think about what mental health is and how we thought we could sort of box it in normalcy. And I think it's also a lot about bodies and being poisoned, right? And that's why, like psychedelics, I mean, Derrida said pharmacon. Pharmacon is a medicine, and it's also a poison, right? Whatever you take is a medicine and a poison. The homeopathy says you have to take the poison in very small amounts to heal yourself. I don't believe in homeopathy, but that's the idea, pharmacon. And I think psychedelics can be understood as pharmacon, which is, as Derrida would say, it's an aporia, right? It can heal, but it can also make you crazy, right? It has two kinds. If you want to fly with the condors, you have to crawl with the worms, you say in ayahuasca. I like that stuff as well, and everybody who has been experimenting with it, yes, there are bad trips. And yes, some bad trips really fuck up with your nervous system. So, but that doesn't mean we need to fundamentally avoid it, right? No, skeptical of good name for psychiatry. Yeah.
How do you differentiate between motivation and bias? Because I think you talked about psychedelics can improve mental health, and that was a bias.
It's an idea.
Exactly. So I would think that it's actually a motivation to.
It's a bias which motivates us to do certain research. Of course, bias for me is also not a negative word. I think, like as a cultural analyst, I study bias, right? I'm not against bias. It's just important that you're aware of bias and that you're not in the illusion that it's like sort of scientific truth, right? Because science is about methods. You have certain hypotheses, you have certain ideas, then you start working with them, you have certain outcomes which work in the function of your bias. So you have to know what your bias is. And yeah, if the bias is if the idea is, because then it's not a bias but an idea, psychedelics will heal mental health, then there's motivation to research that. That's the hypothesis, and that's scientific. I'm not against the science of what's going on there. So yeah, good question, because then the conclusion is that at some point we're starting to forget that it was just one idea that we had with this stuff. I mean, we might start to forget other ideas because this one idea is getting dominant, and also because then it can be sold functionalist. If it's sold functionalist, it can be sold scientific or pseudo-scientific. We can purge the hippies and all wear our science coats. And then sometimes the results are fine, but also maybe not so jubilant anyway, right? So haven't we been sold on an idea which now ultimately leads us just to sell products and make us rich, which is fine, but you know, and that's also part of being careful with the uncritical enthusiasm. And please go ahead, because I think I'm of course also in awe of what's coming out of these labs. I am in awe of what's coming out of the labs, but we have to be critical. Yeah. Others.
Maybe a bit out of the box question.
Please, that's only questions I.
What would you advise for somebody who has all these biases, who does recreation trip? How would you advise them to go into the next trip?
And who wants to go into a trip?
Yeah, because we usually go on these trips
Oh, yeah.
for our own biases. Is there something you would advise for it?
Okay, there's two things here, of course. There's the bias in our research on psychedelics, and then there is the set, which is the mindset, which you always have when you go into a trip, right? And that's what you're referring to now. So in cultural studies, you have this concept of hermeneutics. Hermeneutics is that you are always in the world and you always have an idea about how things are. But by experience, your ideas change. But you already had ideas, because if you didn't have any ideas, your ideas couldn't change, right? And then you're in a new level and you have learned something new, and then you go back in, you know? And that's a circle. We call it a hermeneutical circle. There is no cultural truth. There's just, you know something, you think you know something, you become aware of what you know, you with that knowledge you're going to read a book, and then you get like new knowledge out of it. You know, I can read the Bible 100 times, and every time it's new, right? And I'm not even Christian, so it doesn't matter, right? Texts are just a sort of input. Okay, so back to your question. I think it doesn't matter, right? You have biases, you have ideas, that's your set. I say don't go in a trip if you're like really afraid of it, but sometimes fear can be also good. I think don't go into it when you have certain ideas about how it's gonna cure everything, because you're gonna necessarily be disappointed. Disappointment is always the result of too high expectations. But also don't, like with meditation, don't try to not think, but just observe your thoughts. Don't try to not have biases, but yeah, just be spontaneous in your experience, right? And if it's about personal, that's what I would advise, I think. Yeah, just be open, like out of the box, just be open. And that's the thing, right? It's not gonna heal you from anything, and maybe it does. It's not gonna show you the truth or some spiritual reality, and maybe it does. That's the same with meditation, right? I mean, it's not gonna ultimately do anything for you. But it doesn't take away that it's valuable, and that it can lead to imaginations, right? And imaginations can be very useless, but they can be great in themselves. And a lot of my colleagues in humanities are like, why do you study this stuff? Well, just because I think it's valuable in itself. I think it's a crappy reason, but it's a thing you very often hear people. Why do you like music? Yeah, but just because I like it. It's not like, I listen to music because it makes me more sexually active. Like, nobody's going to say that. You're just going to say because you like music, right? And I think that aesthetic quality without a functional dimension, that's nice. That's a nice thing about psychedelics. It's a great video screen. Anybody else? Of course, I have some crazy slides left as well. But
that's it. Can we give another big applause?